Hey there, history lovers across America. Buckle up for a jaw-dropping tale straight from the heart of the Civil War South, a story so intense it'll leave you speechless. Picture this, a small Tennessee farm, shrouded in fear, where one woman's unbreakable spirit and a forbidden love sparked a daring fight for freedom. This isn't just a story, it's a roller coaster of courage, betrayal, and survival that'll keep you glued to your screen. So, smash that subscribe button, grab your coffee, and let's dive into a saga that proves the human spirit can conquer even the darkest of times. In the summer of 1864, while the Civil War tore through the South in the rolling hills of Madison County, Tennessee, a small rural property became the stage for one of the most extraordinary acts of courage and survival ever witnessed in the region. Between modest cotton fields and a wooden house that had echoed with years of terror, a desperate woman would find the strength to break free from a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The story you're about to hear began as what appeared to be a simple case of wartime abandonment, but revealed itself to be something far more profound, a tale of a victim who refused to remain a victim, and the incredible lengths to which the human spirit will go when fighting for freedom and survival. What unfolded on the Thompson property that summer wasn't just a crime. It was an act of liberation that would challenge everything the local community thought they knew about justice, courage, and the power of love to triumph over cruelty. James Thompson was known throughout Madison County as a man of volatile temperament and casual cruelty, who seemed to find genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. At 43 years old, he had inherited the modest 60-acre property from his father 9 years earlier, along with 2 slaves and a reputation that oscillated between feared and despised by the neighbors in the region. The property was located just 1 mile from the main road that connected the small towns of the region, close enough to civilization that the screams that occasionally echoed from the house could be heard by the nearest neighbors. It was a proximity that should have offered protection, but the social conventions of the era discouraged interference in domestic matters. James possessed an intimidating physical presence that he used as a tool of constant domination. His piercing gray eyes seemed to constantly calculate weaknesses and opportunities to exercise power, and his large hands were frequently clenched into fists when speaking with anyone on the property. The farm operated as a modest agricultural operation focused primarily on cotton and corn cultivation for subsistence and local sale. The inheritance of the property had come to James under circumstances that revealed much about his nature. His father, Henry Thompson, had died suddenly of a heart attack in 1856. Leaving specific instructions in his will about how the property should be administered. Henry had included detailed clauses about the treatment of slaves and land maintenance, suggesting he knew well his son's cruel tendencies and tried to limit them even after death. James had completely ignored these instructions from the first day, immediately establishing a reign of terror that surpassed even the brutal standards of the era. Clara, the older slave, had served the Thompson family for more than 30 years. Her graying hair always tied in a faded red kerchief, she moved through the house with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible to survive. The scars on her arms and faded marks on her face told stories of decades of abuse that she would never verbalize. Samuel, the younger slave, had arrived at the property 8 years earlier, purchased at an auction in Memphis for $250. Tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed a physical strength that James had initially considered valuable for heavy work, but which he gradually came to see as a potential threat. Unlike Clara, Samuel occasionally maintained eye contact when speaking, an audacity that deeply irritated his owner. Samuel's purchase had been motivated by the need to replace an older slave who had died during a particularly harsh winter. James had traveled to Memphis with the specific intention of finding a young, strong man, but had also looked for someone who had no close family or connections that could complicate his ownership. Samuel had been sold by a family moving to Arkansas, and his lack of local ties had been seen by James as an advantage. What he hadn't foreseen was that Samuel's natural intelligence and his refusal to submit completely would create a constant tension that would grow over the years. The daily routine on the property followed a rigid pattern established by James through years of systematic intimidation. Mornings began before dawn with Clara preparing coffee, while Samuel tended to the animals and worked in the fields. Each task was supervised with obsessive attention to detail, and any deviation from the established pattern resulted in punishments that were both creative and cruel. The main house, built of oak with 2 stories, reflected the austere personality of its owner. The furniture was functional, but devoid of any touch of human warmth, and the windows were kept with heavy curtains that blocked natural light, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere. During the day, James frequently disappeared for hours, visiting the local tavern, where he drank heavily and boasted about his ability to maintain order on his property. The other farmers tolerated him out of social necessity, but few considered him a true friend. At the tavern, he was known for provoking fights and humiliating men he considered weaker. It was also at the tavern that James constantly heard about opportunities in the American West. Men spoke about gold discoveries in Montana, about silver in Arizona, about cities that sprang up overnight where anyone could start life over. When particularly intoxicated, James would declare that one day he would leave to make his fortune in the Western Territories, places where a man could be whatever he wanted, and where no one asked questions about the past. The nearest neighbors, the Wilson family, lived just half a mile away, and occasionally reported hearing screams coming from the direction of the Thompson property. Mary Wilson had once tried to approach James about the disturbing noises, but was met with such intense hostility that she never again dared to question his domestic practices. Nights on the Thompson property were particularly sinister. Without the distraction of daily work, James's violent nature manifested more intensely and unpredictably. During the winter months, when agricultural work decreased significantly, violence often intensified alarmingly. Clara and Samuel had developed a complex system of silent signals to communicate about James's mood and alert each other to imminent dangers. It was a language of survival born of absolute necessity, refined through years of experience with his explosive volatility. The Thompson property had become an island of brutality that existed in constant tension with the more civilized world that surrounded it. It was in this toxic environment that the events of summer 1864 would begin to unfold, setting the stage for a tragedy that would reveal how far a person can go when pushed beyond all limits of human endurance. In April 1861, a dusty carriage had slowly climbed the road leading to the Thompson property, carrying with it a young woman who would forever change the sinister dynamics of the property. Elizabeth, at 27 years old, arrived as the result of a matrimonial arrangement that had been negotiated between families as a cold and calculating commercial transaction without any consideration for her feelings or personal desires. The marriage had been arranged through intermediaries who operated between rural families, connecting single men with women from families who needed to reduce their financial responsibilities. Elizabeth's family, impoverished by a series of bad harvests and growing debts, had seen the marriage as a solution to their economic problems. James, in turn, had sought a wife primarily to care for the house and eventually produce heirs, viewing marriage as a practical transaction rather than a romantic one. The modest dowry that accompanied Elizabeth included some family jewelry and a small amount of money, resources that James had quickly incorporated into his own assets, without any consideration for his new wife's feelings. The morning of July 20th, 1864, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to foreshadow disturbing events. Clara woke before dawn, as always, to prepare breakfast, but something was fundamentally different in the house that morning. The silence that hung over the property was deeper than usual, charged with tension she couldn't completely identify. James Thompson had disappeared during the night, leaving behind only a letter that Elizabeth discovered on the kitchen table when she came down for breakfast. Her hands trembled visibly as she read the document, and her expression of shock seemed too genuine to be acting. The letter, written in James's recognizable handwriting, contained a confession that no one had expected. The letter began with a cold formality typical of James, addressing Elizabeth and explaining that when she read those words, he would have already left the property forever. The document revealed that he could no longer continue living a lie that had become unbearable to his conscience, especially in times of war when death could come at any moment. The content continued, revealing that James had secretly enlisted in the Confederate Army under a false name, unable to bear any longer the guilt of not fighting for the Southern cause. He explained that he had departed during the night to join a regiment in Nashville, determined to find honor in war that he couldn't find at home. The letter went on to describe Elizabeth as a good woman who deserved better, leaving the property and all possessions to her. The letter was dated July 19th and signed with James's characteristic signature. There were no obvious signs of coercion or forgery, and the content, though shocking, was not completely inconsistent with the erratic behavior James had demonstrated in recent weeks. The paper of the letter was of common quality, the type sold at the local general store, and the ink seemed fresh, but not too recent to raise suspicions. Elizabeth had noticed that some words were slightly smudged, as if the writer had hesitated or trembled during writing, a detail she mentioned to Clara as evidence of James's disturbed emotional state. The letter also contained some stains that could have been tears, or simply drops of sweat, adding a layer of emotional authenticity that made it difficult to question its legitimacy at first glance. Elizabeth immediately called Clara and Samuel, showing them the letter with an expression of disbelief and confusion that seemed absolutely authentic. Clara examined the document carefully, confirming that the handwriting was James's, although she noticed a slight difference in style that she attributed to the disturbed emotional state he must have been in when writing. The initial search of the property revealed that some of James's clothes were missing, along with a small amount of money he kept in a safe in the office. His favorite horse had also disappeared, apparently taken during the night without anyone hearing departure noises. Samuel, when questioned, reported hearing sounds of a horse moving during the night around Tendhan, but had assumed James was simply checking the animals. The sound had come from the direction of the main road, consistent with someone leaving the property. News of the disappearance spread quickly through the rural community, generating a mixture of shock and secret relief among those who had been subjected to his cruelty. The Wilsons were the first neighbors to visit, offering support to Elizabeth during what they assumed was a period of traumatic abandonment. Mary Wilson reported hearing the sound of a horse galloping on the main road the previous night around 10:30. The sound had been distinct in the quiet of the rural night, and she had assumed someone was traveling in a war-related emergency with limited resources due to the war. The local investigation was conducted by County Sheriff Thomas Reed, who had remained in his position mainly because he had an injured arm that prevented him from military service. Reed conducted a basic investigation, interviewing the property residents and examining the letter. Reed was a meticulous man by nature, but war circumstances had forced adaptations in his investigative methods. With most young men serving in the army and scarce resources being directed to the war effort, he had learned to focus on the most essential aspects of each case. His 16 years of experience as sheriff had taught him to quickly identify the most obvious signs of crime, but had also developed a practical understanding of when it was better to accept plausible explanations in extraordinary times like those. Reed interviewed Elizabeth, Clara, and Samuel separately, examined the letter carefully, and searched for signs of struggle or coercion in the house and surroundings. His conclusion was that the disappearance seemed voluntary, consistent with many men who had left for war in similar ways. The search for James was limited to neighboring towns, where Reed questioned some merchants and tavern owners. Some reported seeing solitary riders passing during the night, but descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Attempts to track the supposed enlistment were hampered by the chaos of war and the claim that he had used a false name. Elizabeth cooperated completely with the investigation, providing access to the house and James's documents. Her sadness seemed genuine, though tempered by an understandable sense of relief at being free from a marriage everyone knew was difficult. During the weeks following the disappearance, Elizabeth demonstrated surprising competence in managing the property. She made practical decisions about animal care, house maintenance, and slave supervision. Her transformation from submissive wife to independent owner was noted by neighbors, but attributed to the necessity of survival. The official investigation was closed after 2 weeks, with the conclusion that James Thompson had abandoned his family to enlist in the Confederate Army. The lack of evidence of crime, combined with the explanatory letter and the context of war, led local authorities to classify the case as domestic abandonment related to the conflict. Weeks turned into months, and life on the Thompson property gradually assumed a new normalcy that was notably more peaceful. Elizabeth proved to be a more humane owner, treating the slaves with more dignity and significantly reducing the atmosphere of terror that had characterized the property. However, attentive observers noticed subtle changes in Elizabeth that suggested her experience had left deep marks. She had become more reserved in her social interactions, more calculating in her decisions, and occasionally demonstrated a coldness that was difficult to explain completely. As autumn 1864 approached, the Thompson property had settled into a routine that seemed stable despite the uncertainties of war. However, forces were moving beneath the apparently tranquil surface that would soon disturb this newly established peace. 5 months after James Thompson's disappearance, on a cold December morning in 1864, neighbors of the Thompson property woke to discover that something even more disturbing had occurred during the night. Elizabeth Thompson and the slave Samuel had vanished without a trace, abandoning the property in complete silence and mystery. The discovery was made by Mary Wilson, who had developed the habit of checking the Thompson property weekly since James's disappearance. When she arrived on the morning of December 15th for her routine visit, she found the house completely empty and silent. The front door was unlocked, something unthinkable for a woman alone on a rural property. Inside the house, Mary found evidence of a departure that seemed to have been both hurried and planned. Some drawers were open and empty. Clothes had clearly been selected and removed, but the house showed no signs of struggle or violence. Clara, the older slave, was found alone in the barn, apparently terrified and reluctant to explain what had happened. When finally persuaded to speak, her story was confused and full of gaps that suggested genuine fear or knowledge of information she didn't want to reveal for her own safety. Clara explained with a trembling voice that Elizabeth had said she needed to leave. According to Clara, Elizabeth claimed to have received news that James had died in the war and that her relatives would come to claim the property. She and Samuel had departed during the night, taking only some clothes and a little money she had saved. Clara's story, though plausible on the surface considering the context of war, contained inconsistencies that immediately raised suspicions. No official correspondence had arrived at the property in the days before the disappearance, and Elizabeth had given few indications of concern about family or legal matters related to inheritance. Sheriff Reed was notified about this second disappearance, and his reaction was one of immediate suspicion. The coincidence of 2 disappearances from the same property in less than 5 months was unusual, but not without precedent in times when entire families were frequently separated by conflict. Reed conducted a more detailed investigation this time, interrogating Clara extensively and searching for evidence in the house that could explain the sudden disappearance. During the more intensive interrogation, Clara gradually revealed additional details she had initially omitted. She admitted to having observed whispered conversations between Elizabeth and Samuel in the weeks before the disappearance, conversations that ceased abruptly whenever she approached. There was an intimacy between them that went beyond the normal relationship between owner and slave. Clara finally admitted that they spoke like people who shared secrets. Clara also revealed that Elizabeth had discreetly sold various jewelry and valuable objects in the months after James's disappearance, especially in the last weeks before her own departure. Local merchants, when questioned, confirmed these transactions, revealing that Elizabeth had systematically converted personal goods into money. The transactions had been conducted with a discretion that now seemed suspicious in retrospect. Elizabeth had visited different merchants in neighboring towns, never selling more than 1 or 2 items to the same person, and always claiming urgent needs related to property maintenance during her husband's absence. A merchant in Jackson recalled that she had specifically asked about the possibility of converting jewelry into gold coins, claiming that paper money was becoming less reliable during the war. Another merchant in Brownsville mentioned that she had demonstrated unusual knowledge about market values, negotiating prices with a shrewdness that suggested careful planning rather than desperate need. The discovery that Elizabeth had liquidated valuable assets before disappearing transformed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer an impulsive departure motivated by war news, but rather a carefully planned escape that had been prepared over weeks or possibly months. During the search of the office, Reed found a drawer that had been left slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside the drawer, among various papers and property documents, he discovered a small diary bound in brown leather clearly belonging to Elizabeth that had apparently been abandoned. What most intrigued Reed was the location of the diary. If Elizabeth had carefully planned her departure over months, why would she leave behind such a personal and potentially incriminating document? The drawer wasn't completely closed, as if the diary had been placed there deliberately to be found. Reed noted in his personal notes that it was very strange for a woman to forget her personal diary, especially if she was fleeing, considering they had months to plan. That didn't seem like an oversight. The diary contained sparse entries dating from Elizabeth's arrival at the property in April 1861 to just a few days before her disappearance. The pages weren't completely filled, but contained sufficient records to reveal the true nature of life on the Thompson property over the past 3 years. The first entries were brief and described Elizabeth's arrival as a reluctant bride and her initial attempts to adapt to the arranged marriage. The first entry from April 1861 recorded her arrival at the Thompson property, describing how James had received her with coldness. No welcome kisses, just a handshake that was too firm. The following entries revealed a growing pattern of abuse and domestic violence. An entry from July 1861 recorded that James had beaten her because she questioned why Clara received so little food. Other entries documented cruel punishments, constant humiliations, and psychological isolation that had gradually broken Elizabeth's spirit. But it was in the most recent entries that Reed found revelations that left him deeply disturbed. Elizabeth had begun documenting a growing closeness with Samuel, a connection that had evolved into something much deeper and more dangerous than a simple friendship. An entry from 1863 recorded that Samuel was the only person who treated her with kindness. When he spoke to her, she saw humanity in his eyes. It was dangerous to feel attracted to him, but she couldn't help it. The final entries revealed that Elizabeth had discovered she was pregnant, and that the child could only be Samuel's since James had become completely incapable of consummating the marriage due to alcohol and his violent nature. It was a situation that placed both in mortal danger if discovered. Reed closed the diary temporarily, processing the implications of what he had read. The discovery of this document completely transformed the investigation, revealing that what had begun as separate cases of mysterious disappearances was in fact intimately connected in ways no one had imagined. Reed noted in his personal reflections that Elizabeth wanted someone to know the truth, but also wanted enough time to escape before being discovered. The diary was an explanation of why they did what they did. The final pages of Elizabeth's diary would reveal details that would completely transform Sheriff Reed's understanding of the events at the Thompson property. The most recent entries, written in the months leading up to James's disappearance, documented not only the forbidden relationship between Elizabeth and Samuel, but also a desperate plan that had taken a completely unexpected direction. An entry from June 1864 declared that Elizabeth had discovered she was expecting a child. The child could only be Samuel's, as James hadn't touched her as a husband for more than a year. When he found out, he would kill them both. There was no escape while he was alive. The following entries revealed that Elizabeth and Samuel had discussed their limited options during weeks of whispered conversations. Fleeing would be impossible while James was alive, as he would pursue them relentlessly. Staying meant certain death when the pregnancy became visible. There was only one solution they could see. An entry from early July recorded that they had decided James had to die. Samuel knew poisonous plants that grew in the nearby forest. They could mix small amounts in his food over weeks, making it seem like he was getting sick. When he died, it would look like a fever or stomach illness. The plan was meticulous and gradual. They had identified several toxic plants that grew naturally in the region, including foxglove and deadly nightshade, that could be dried and ground into fine powder. The idea was to administer small doses over several weeks, simulating a progressive illness. An entry from July 15th recorded that Samuel had brought the first plants. They dried everything in the barn and ground it into powder. They would start the next day, mixing small amounts in his morning coffee. James never suspected anything Elizabeth cooked. Elizabeth had planned every detail with impressive precision. She documented how she had observed James's eating habits, identifying dishes where the bitter taste of the plants would be most easily disguised. They had even prepared a story about a possible fever epidemic in the region. The diary revealed that Elizabeth had carefully studied the symptoms the chosen plants would produce, discreetly consulting a medical almanac that had belonged to James's father. She had discovered that the specific combination of toxins would create symptoms that would perfectly mimic an intestinal fever, common in the region during summer months. Samuel, in turn, had demonstrated surprising knowledge about poisonous plants, knowledge he had acquired during his youth when he was forced to forage in the forest to supplement the scarce rations provided by previous owners. An entry revealed that she had found someone who would help them with the staging, a man who owed gambling money and needed to leave the region urgently. For $60, he would ride down the road on the night they chose, ensuring the Wilsons saw James depart. Elizabeth had forged the abandonment letter weeks before, meticulously practicing James's handwriting until she achieved an imitation that would fool any casual observer. She had carefully chosen the military enlistment story because it was plausible in the context of war and would explain why James would never return. But it was the entry from July 19th that left Reed completely shocked, revealing how events had taken a completely different direction from the original plan. The handwriting was slightly shaky, suggesting it had been written under extreme emotional stress. The entry explained that everything had changed the previous night in a way they never could have predicted. The careful plan had become irrelevant in a matter of minutes, and now they faced a much more dangerous and urgent situation. The entry described how James had come home on the night of July 18th in a state of drunkenness and fury that surpassed even his usual standards of violence. He had lost a significant amount of money in card games at the tavern and had been publicly humiliated by other men who questioned his masculinity for not fighting in the war. The diary described how he had entered the house like a wounded and furious animal. His eyes had a madness Elizabeth had never seen before, a thirst for violence that seemed to completely consume any vestige of humanity. She knew immediately that this night would be different. James had started drinking heavily, consuming almost an entire bottle of whiskey while pacing through the house like a caged predator. He had screamed obscenities about his own cowardice, about the war, about the men who were fighting while he remained at home. Around 10 Sagreens at night, according to the diary, he had gone to Elizabeth's room. But this time it wasn't just to beat or humiliate. There was something in his eyes that told her he intended to kill her that night. He said he was tired of looking at her face and that it was time to clean house. The attack that followed was described in details that revealed a brutality that surpassed even the cruel standards James had established. He had begun strangling Elizabeth with his own hands, whispering that he would finally do something useful with his life by getting rid of her before leaving for war. The diary recorded that she couldn't breathe and was losing consciousness when she heard footsteps running down the hallway. Samuel must have heard her muffled screams and come to investigate, something he had never done before, because he knew interfering meant certain death. But this time, he must have realized she was really dying. Samuel had burst into the room exactly when James was about to break her neck, and without hesitation, had thrown himself on the man who had tormented them for years. The fight was brief, but violent. James was drunk and surprised, while Samuel was desperate and fighting not only for Elizabeth's life but for both their freedom. Elizabeth described how she had watched, still struggling to catch her breath, while Samuel strangled James with a determination she had never seen before. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a cold resolution that this had to be done for them to survive. The diary recorded that James fought for a few minutes, but alcohol had weakened his strength, and Samuel was younger and fighting for their lives. When he finally stopped moving, they both stood in silence for a long time, looking at the body and realizing their lives had changed forever. The entry described how they had spent the rest of the night adapting their original plan to accommodate the new reality. The gradual poisoning would no longer be necessary, but they still needed to make the body disappear and create the illusion that James had left voluntarily. The diary recorded that they carried the body to the south field before dawn. Samuel dug a deep grave under the large oak, while Elizabeth burned James's bloodied clothes and cleaned any evidence of the fight from the room. They worked in silence, both understanding that their survival depended on leaving no trace. They had buried James more than 6 feet deep, carefully covering the grave with dirt and leaves to disguise any soil disturbance. James's horse was released several miles away, where it would naturally return home in a few days, creating the impression it had been abandoned during a journey. An entry revealed that the man hired for the staging had still fulfilled his part. He rode down the road exactly as planned, and the Wilsons saw him leave, thinking it was James. The story was complete, but now they had to be even more careful and wait for the right moment to depart. The following entries, written throughout August to November, revealed how Elizabeth had managed the property while carefully planning their escape. She had gradually sold jewelry and valuable objects, converting them into money that could be easily transported. Elizabeth also documented how she had cultivated relationships with people who could help them in their escape. She had discovered some people who operated secretly in the region, individuals who occasionally helped fugitive slaves and others who needed to disappear during the chaos of war. A November entry revealed that she had met a woman in Jackson who could provide basic travel papers. For $120, she would give them simple documents that could help them pass through checkpoints without raising too many suspicions. The entries also revealed how Elizabeth had obtained information about possible destinations. She had written that James always talked about gold discoveries in Montana and silver in Arizona when he returned from the tavern. Ironically, his own words had given her the idea of where to flee. The diary's final entry, dated December 13th, revealed Elizabeth's final plans. She had carefully chosen the timing of their departure, taking advantage of a moonless night and the fact that local attention was focused on recent war news. The final entry declared they would depart the following night. Everything was prepared, the papers were ready, the money was hidden, and they had enough clothes for the journey. They would travel as lady and slave until they reached the Western Territories, where Samuel could pass as a free man. But it was the last line of the final entry that most intrigued Reed. Elizabeth had written that if someone found the diary, they would know they had gone to Louisville, where they could start a new life. The discovery of these revelations left Reed in a state of shock. What he had initially assumed to be a simple case of domestic abandonment had revealed itself to be a carefully covered murder, but a murder that had occurred under circumstances that complicated any simple moral judgment. Reed noted in his reflections that a woman capable of planning such an elaborate murder and forging a perfect abandonment letter would certainly be capable of planting false clues in her own diary. The specific mention of Louisville was too much information to be an accidental oversight. Reed developed a theory that Elizabeth had left the diary purposefully as a way to ensure that the truth about James would eventually be known, but also as a justification for their actions. It was a document that revealed not only a murder, but also years of systematic abuse that had led to that final moment. The official investigation was formally closed in January 1865, with the conclusion that James Thompson had been killed by his wife and slave, under circumstances involving both premeditation and self-defense. Elizabeth Thompson and Samuel were listed as fugitives wanted for homicide. The Thompson property was eventually sold to cover debts and legal costs. Clara was sold to a family in Chattanooga, where she lived her remaining years carrying the secrets of what she had witnessed, occasionally whispering fragments of the story to other slaves. The discovery of the truth about James Thompson's death shocked the local community, though attention was quickly diverted by more urgent war events. The story of an abused wife and a courageous slave who had killed a domestic tyrant captured the imagination of those who heard it. Reed kept the diary with him, occasionally rereading the entries and wondering about the fugitives' final fate. He never knew if they managed to reach the freedom they sought, but secretly hoped they had found the peace they deserved. In June 1869, 4 years after the end of the Civil War, Clara was found on her deathbed in a small cabin on the outskirts of Chattanooga. At 74 years old, with health weakened by decades of hard work and the traumas she had witnessed, she knew her days were numbered. Sheriff Reed, now retired but still living in the region, was called when Clara expressed the desire to make a final confession about the events she had witnessed at the Thompson property. Arriving at the cabin on a rainy June afternoon, he found a frail but mentally lucid woman determined to reveal truths she had kept for years. Clara began with a weak but firm voice, explaining that there were things she had never told about that terrible night at the property, things she had seen, things she had heard. Now that the war was over and she was dying, she needed to clear her conscience. Her confession revealed details that weren't present in Elizabeth's diary, adding layers of complexity to an already disturbing story. Clara had witnessed the events of that fatal night much more closely than any investigator had realized. Clara revealed that she was awake that night because James had come home making a lot of noise. He was more drunk and more furious than she had ever seen. He was screaming about the war, about lost money, about how he was going to clean house before leaving to fight. Clara's confession confirmed the basic details of the diary, but added perspectives that revealed the true nature of that night. She had heard James stumbling up the stairs, had heard the sound of furniture being knocked over, And then Elizabeth's muffled screams that made her realize this time was different. Clara explained that Elizabeth's screams were different that night. They weren't the screams of pain she had heard so many times before. They were screams of someone who was dying, someone who couldn't breathe. That's when she knew Samuel had to do something. Clara described how she had seen Samuel run out of his cabin at the back of the property, something he had never done before during James's violent episodes. Normally, they had learned to hide and wait for the storm to pass, but that night there was an urgency that transcended the usual fear. Clara recalled that Samuel ran to the house like a man possessed. She had never seen him move so fast or with such determination. He knew that interfering meant certain death, but he also knew that not interfering would mean losing the woman he loved. Clara's confession also revealed that she had witnessed part of the fight through a first-floor window. Although she couldn't see all the details in the darkness, she had observed silhouettes moving violently, had heard the sound of furniture being broken, and then a sudden silence that was more terrifying than any noise. Clara confirmed that she had discreetly helped with preparations to hide the body, though she stayed away during the actual burial. She had provided tools from the barn and had helped burn the bloodied clothes, but had refused to approach the place where James was buried. Clara explained that she helped because she knew they had no choice. James was going to kill Elizabeth that night, and probably would have killed Samuel and her too, to hide what he had done. Samuel saved their lives when he saved Elizabeth's. The most significant revelation from Clara was about the moments immediately after James's death. She had observed Elizabeth and Samuel working together with an efficiency that suggested that although the specific moment hadn't been planned, they were mentally prepared for this possibility. Clara observed that they moved like people who had already thought about what to do if something like this happened. There was no panic, no hesitation. It was as if they had mentally rehearsed this situation many times. Clara also revealed details about Elizabeth's emotional state in the hours following the murder. Unlike what one might expect, Elizabeth had demonstrated a calm that was almost supernatural. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, showed no sign of regret. It was as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The most touching revelation from Clara was about the moment of Elizabeth and Samuel's departure. She had been the only witness to their farewell, watching as they prepared to leave forever, the property that had been both prison and home. Clara recalled with tears in her eyes that when they left, Elizabeth hugged her and said she hoped she could forgive them for what they had done. Clara told her there was nothing to forgive, that they had done what anyone would do to survive. Clara also revealed crucial information about the true destination of Elizabeth and Samuel that completely contradicted what was written in the diary. Although the diary mentioned Louisville, Clara had heard conversations that suggested a completely different destination. Clara revealed that they never spoke about Louisville in her presence. What she heard were conversations about the West, about territories where no one asked questions, and where a black man and white woman could live together without attracting attention. Elizabeth was too smart to write their true destination in the diary. This revelation confirmed Reed's suspicions that the mention of Louisville had been deliberately misleading. Elizabeth had planted a false clue in her own diary, demonstrating a level of strategic planning that went beyond what he had initially imagined. Clara continued, explaining that they talked about places like Montana or Arizona. Elizabeth knew about these territories because James always talked about gold and silver discoveries when he returned from the tavern. He said men were getting rich in the West, that they were places where anyone could start life over. She paid attention to these conversations even when he was too drunk to notice. Clara also revealed that Elizabeth had obtained help from some people who operated secretly in the region, individuals who occasionally helped fugitive slaves, and others who needed to disappear during the chaos of war. The war had made their operations easier, because there were so many refugees and displaced people that a few more wouldn't attract attention. The confession included details about how Clara had observed Elizabeth studying maps she had discreetly obtained, maps that showed routes to the west that avoided major cities and military posts. Elizabeth had spent hours tracing possible paths with her finger, calculating distances, and identifying points where they could obtain supplies without raising suspicions. Clara recalled seeing Elizabeth burn these maps in the fireplace a few days before their departure, but not before having completely memorized the routes she had chosen. Clara's confession included her own struggle with guilt over the years. Although she recognized that James had deserved his fate and that Samuel had acted in self-defense, she had carried the weight of being an accomplice in a murder, even if justified. Clara admitted that she lived all those years knowing she helped hide a body. But she also lived knowing that if she hadn't helped, 2 innocent people would have been killed by a monster. She made the right choice, even though it was a terrible choice to have to make. Clara admitted with a mixture of sadness and hope that she never heard from them again after they left. Sometimes she wondered if they managed to reach the West, if the child was born healthy, if they found the peace they sought. But she never received news, never heard rumors. Maybe it was better that way. It meant they were too safe to risk any contact with the past. Clara died 3 days after making her confession, taking with her the last direct secrets of the events at the Thompson property. Her death marked the official end of any hope of discovering the true fate of Elizabeth and Samuel, leaving their story as a permanent mystery. Reed recorded Clara's confession in his personal notes. In his final reflections, he observed that the story of the Thompson property served as a complex study of justice, survival, and the limits of human endurance. Reed wrote that the case demonstrated the disturbing complexity of situations where victims become perpetrators out of necessity. Elizabeth Thompson and Samuel were simultaneously murderers and heroes, depending on the perspective of whoever tells the story. The Thompson property case remained officially open with Elizabeth and Samuel still listed as wanted fugitives decades after their disappearance. However, the reality was that they had executed an escape during the chaos of war that made them practically impossible to track. The property itself was eventually abandoned after several failed resale attempts. New owners consistently reported a sense of discomfort that seemed to permeate the land, especially in the area near the large oak where James had been buried. Nature gradually reclaimed the property with vines and weeds covering the ruined buildings. During the Reconstruction years, the property was briefly used as a camp by workers building a new road, but they reported disturbing dreams and an oppressive atmosphere that led them to move to another location. Stories about the haunted property spread among the workers, adding a layer of local legend to the very real tragedy that had occurred there. In the following decades, the story of Elizabeth Thompson and Samuel became a local legend that transcended its specific origin, serving as a tale about courage, love, and the extreme limits to which people can be pushed before fighting for their lives. It was a story that offered no easy answers or simple moral judgments. The case revealed the typical social tensions of the South during the Civil War, where systems of oppression created conditions that could force people to make extreme decisions to survive. The story of Elizabeth Thompson and Samuel illustrated how love and desperation can lead ordinary people to extraordinary acts. Reed lived to be 83, occasionally receiving visitors interested in the story of the Thompson property. He always told the story with a mixture of professional fascination and secret admiration, recognizing that he had witnessed a well-executed escape. Reed used to say in his later years that Elizabeth Thompson and Samuel executed one of the most justified crimes he had ever investigated. They killed a man who deserved to die, saved lives in the process, and disappeared without a trace. Whether that was justice or crime, he left for others to decide. In his final years, Reed occasionally wondered if Elizabeth and Samuel had managed to find the happiness they sought, if they had raised their daughter safely, and if they had managed to build the peaceful life they deserved after years of suffering. The absence of news gave him hope that they had. The transformation of Elizabeth from victim to survivor and Samuel from slave to hero remained one of the most inspiring aspects of the case. They had found strength in each other to resist a tyrant, and when pushed to the absolute limit, had fought for their lives and won against all odds. The relationship between Elizabeth and Samuel also challenged the social conventions of the era in ways that went far beyond the racial issue. It was a partnership forged in shared suffering, tempered by genuine love, and tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The story of the Thompson property became a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, love and courage can triumph over cruelty and oppression. It illustrated how ordinary people can find extraordinary strength when fighting not only for their own lives, but for the lives of those they love. More than 160 years have passed since the events at the Thompson property, and the final fate of Elizabeth and Samuel remains a mystery that continues to inspire those who hear their story. Despite decades of sporadic searches and countless theories, no reliable trace of the brave fugitives has ever been discovered, perhaps the greatest testament to their intelligence and determination. The revelation that Louisville had been a false clue deliberately planted in the diary showcased Elizabeth's remarkable strategic mind. Far from being a cold-blooded killer, she was a brilliant survivor who understood that her freedom and her very life depended on staying one step ahead of those who would drag her back to hell. Some believe they managed to successfully establish themselves in one of the rapidly growing mining towns of the West, where the gold and silver boom had created communities where no one asked questions about the past. Others suggest they may have headed to even more remote territories, perhaps even to Canada, where they could live freely as the family they had always deserved to be. A persistent and hopeful theory is that they settled in one of the many towns that sprang up during westward expansion, where the diversity of war refugees, immigrants, and adventurers created an atmosphere where an interracial couple could build the life they had dreamed of. The frontier offered not just anonymity, but the promise of true freedom. What remains indisputable is that Elizabeth Thompson demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable brutality. Her ability to outmaneuver a sadistic tyrant, protect the man she loved, and disappear completely during the chaos of war revealed not criminal cunning, but the remarkable intelligence and strength that desperation can unlock in the human spirit. The story of the Thompson property serves as a powerful reminder that the line between victim and hero is often defined by a single moment of courage. Elizabeth forces us to confront inspiring questions about survival, love, and how far a person will go to protect those they care about when pushed beyond all endurance. In a world where domestic violence still affects millions of people, the story of Elizabeth Thompson resonates with profound relevance. Her transformation from terrorized victim to agent of her own liberation continues to inspire those who understand that sometimes survival requires extraordinary measures and that true justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. The property where it all happened remains abandoned to this day. But rather than a monument to tragedy, it stands as a testament to the triumph of the human spirit over cruelty. The vegetation-covered ruins guard the secret of two people who refused to accept that their lives were worth less than their oppressor's comfort. The large oak in the south field still grows, its roots deep in the earth that became the final resting place of a tyrant who met the fate he had earned through years of cruelty. Occasionally, visitors explore the ruins, unknowingly walking over the grave of a man whose reign of terror ended the night love and courage finally said enough. The complete absence of news about Elizabeth and Samuel over the years offers not just hope, but confidence that their story had the happy ending they fought so hard to achieve. That love and courage triumphed over cruelty and oppression. In an era when disappearing completely was possible for those brave and intelligent enough, their successful escape represents a satisfying victory of justice over tyranny. The transformation of Elizabeth from victim to survivor and of Samuel from slave to hero remains one of the most inspiring aspects of their story. They found strength in each other to resist a monster, and when pushed to the absolute limit, they fought for their lives and won against impossible odds. The relationship between Elizabeth and Samuel transcended every social barrier of their era, proving that genuine love can flourish even in the darkest circumstances. It was a partnership forged in shared suffering, strengthened by mutual protection, and ultimately victorious through extraordinary courage. The story of the Thompson property became a beacon of hope that even in the most desperate circumstances, love and courage can triumph over cruelty and oppression. It proved that ordinary people can find extraordinary strength when fighting not only for their own lives, but for the lives of those they love. What an incredible story of resilience and defiance against all odds. What are your thoughts on Elizabeth and Samuel's journey? How far would you go to protect someone you love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. If this tale of courage moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's most unforgettable stories. Until next time, keep seeking the truth, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories are won in the shadows.